We all kind of wrestle with it, don't we? Why do people commit crimes? And the usual answers, poverty, maybe their upbringing, mental health.
Yeah, they often feel like, well, not the whole picture.
Exactly. So today, we're going deeper. We're trying to get inside the actual, the mindset of the criminal.
That's the plan. We're diving into Dr. Stanton Samenow's work, specifically his book, Inside the Criminal Mind, and we're trying to move past those easy answers.
Right.
Our goal here is really to pull out the key thinking patterns, the sort of core characteristics that Samenow labels the criminal personality.
And it's fascinating because this isn't about making excuses, is it? It's about really trying to understand.
Precisely.
These excerpts we're looking at, they show these surprising connections, these similarities, and how criminals think, no matter their background or the crime itself.
Get ready for some real, maybe aha moments.
So where do we start with Samenow's ideas?
Well, one of the first things he tackles is that common idea, that criminals just snap.
Right, like they're under so much stress, they just break and do something totally out of character.
Exactly. But Samenow's research, it just doesn't really support that. He hasn't found that to be accurate.
You think about it, right? We hear these stories, someone seems totally normal, responsible even, and then they do something awful. The first reaction is always, what pushed them over the edge?
Mm-hmm. And Samenow suggests we need to look again at events like, say, Neartown, or the Aurora theater shooting, the Navy Yard attack, even the Boston Marathon bombing.
Through a different lens.
Kind of. Especially with terrorism. His perspective is really interesting here. He suggests that for some people, radical ideologies become, well, a vehicle.
A vehicle for what?
For expressing a criminal mindset that was already there. The way they thought beforehand is crucial, maybe even more important than the actual cause they latch onto.
Wow. So the inclination finds an outlet rather than the cause creating the criminal from scratch. That really shifts things.
It does. And it leads straight into his core argument. These incredibly similar thinking patterns exist across all sorts of criminals.
Okay.
Seriously. Whether you're talking about a rich person committing fraud or someone from a really tough background involved in street crime.
It doesn't matter.
The fundamental thought process is, they share these remarkable commonalities. He has these compelling case studies, 2 young men, totally different lives, both commit homicide. The thinking is strikingly similar.
That consistency, regardless of circumstance, it really goes against the grain, doesn't it? Now, mental health always comes up, especially with violent crimes.
Yeah.
How does that fit into Samenow's framework?
That brings up a really critical point, actually. The sheer difficulty mental health professionals face.
In understanding these individuals.
Exactly. And treating them. Samenow really emphasizes how challenging it is because these individuals, they're often masters of deception. They actively hide what's really going on inside.
That makes sense. If they're good at hiding things, then your standard psychological evaluation might miss the mark, right?
It might. You might focus on, say, symptoms of depression or anxiety without seeing that deeper structure, the criminal personality that Samenow describes.
So tell us more about this concept, the criminal personality.
Okay, so it's important to see it as a continuum, these ways of thinking, these tactics. They exist on a spectrum.
Right.
Samenow focuses on the extreme end, the really serious offenders, partly because it makes the patterns much clearer, easier to spot, even in less severe forms in other people.
Okay, so by looking at the extremes, we can learn to recognize similar, maybe less intense tendencies elsewhere. What defines this extreme end? What are the characteristics?
The core elements he identifies are, profound self-centeredness, a really strong need to control others, dishonesty that's just pervasive, a deep, deep sense of irresponsibility, and a real callousness, a lack of concern for others.
And when those all come together?
Samenow argues they create this fundamentally different worldview, a way of seeing themselves in the world that's just radically different from how a responsible person operates.
This really pushes back against so many common ideas about crime, doesn't it? The focus on social factors, economics.
Oh, absolutely. He even mentions that song from West Side Story, gee, Officer Kripke.
Yeah, where the delinquents are portrayed as victims of their environment.
Exactly. It's that satirical take. He also brings up a question from Hobart Mower, wondering if psychoanalysis, by trying to explain everything, might unintentionally end up excusing crime.
And the whole debate around violent media, movies, video games.
Samenow tackles that head on. He points out the obvious. Millions of people watch violent movies or play these games and never commit a crime.
Right.
He mentions research suggesting that for some kids, playing violent video games might even be, a normal part of growing up. And he notes the flaws in studies trying to make a direct link to real violence flaws even the Supreme Court has pointed out.
So it's not the game or the movie itself.
It's about who's playing or watching. That's Semenow's point. The psychological makeup of the person is key. Think about it, we all see terrible things in the news, but most people would never dream of doing them.
He also sounds pretty skeptical about the idea of risk factors identifying future criminals.
He is. He sees them as basically rehashing old ideas that haven't really worked. He asks, if poverty causes crime, why did crime rates like homicide and robbery actually drop during the big recession of 2008-2011?
Huh. That's a good point.
And it happened after the 1929 stock market crash, too. He quotes Richard Cohen, who basically concluded it comes down to bad character.
That's quite a statement. And Samenow even hints that sometimes maybe crime causes poverty.
It's an emerging idea, yeah. Think about the long-term impact on victims. It's definitely not just a one-way street.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. What about the brain? There used to be theories linking brain problems directly to crime, right?
Yes, some early theories definitely went down that road. But Samenow highlights the more modern view in neuroscience. It's more about the dynamic interplay.
Between brain and mind.
Exactly. He mentions people like David Deitch and Adam Gopnik. The brain shapes the mind, sure, but crucially, the mind also shapes the brain.
How does that work?
Think about recovery from drug addiction. That process involves real, measurable changes in the brain driven by changes in thinking and behavior. The brain isn't fixed.
That's important, the potential for change. Now, what about parents? They so often get blamed when kids go off the rails. What's Samenow's perspective?
He definitely addresses that tendency, blaming parenting styles too strict, too lenient, whatever, but he focuses more on the tactics the child uses.
The delinquent child.
Yes, the manipulation, the lying, playing parents off each other, minimizing what they did, pretending to be upset to make parents feel guilty. It's about gaining control.
He gives that example, Emily, right? She was so good at it, even the therapist initially blamed the parents.
Exactly, and Samenow's point is crucial. While a difficult family situation might play a role in some misbehavior, there's not much evidence it causes the kind of persistent, expanding pattern of delinquency he's talking about.
So the family dysfunction isn't necessarily the root cause.
Often, he finds, the delinquent child uses the family as a scapegoat in therapy. It deflects from their own choices.
And it's not just biological parents, is it? He mentions step-parents, too.
Yes, the heartbreaking stories like Tamara trying so hard to connect and just facing constant rejection, manipulation.
It's manipulation, like the temporary good behavior.
The con job, as he calls it. Behaving well just long enough to get something they want, then reverting right back. It's calculated.
It sounds absolutely agonizing for the parents. The grief, the anger, the frustration.
Yeah.
And sometimes having to make that awful decision to cut ties.
It is. And often, the child seems to have very little grasp of the pain they're causing.
Okay, so if it's not solely parenting, what about peers? You know, hanging out with the wrong crowd.
Samenow definitely acknowledges peer pressure, but he shifts the focus. The critical factor isn't the pressure itself, but who the child chooses to hang out with in the first place.
Ah, the choice of friends.
Right. Responsible kids tend to find constructive activities, teams, clubs. Delinquent kids often feel this constant restlessness, boredom. They drop out of things, blame everyone else.
He contrasts that, doesn't he? Like responsible kids hanging out versus what delinquent kids mean by hanging out, using Alan's story.
Yes, Alan's activities were far from innocent. And what's really interesting is Samenow's observation that these kids often feel contempt for their peers, not inferiority.
Contempt. Not like they feel pressured into it.
Not usually, no. He uses that example of Ronald and Larry. It looked like Larry led Ronald astray, but digging deeper showed Ronald's own tendencies were already there. Larry just provided an opportunity.
So peer pressure isn't like a force that makes you commit crimes. It's more about finding people who align with inclinations you already have.
That's the idea. Responsible kids can resist temptation, and if they mess up, they usually feel bad about it. Remorse. That's often missing in developing criminals.
And this challenges that image of the isolated loner, the mass killer who just didn't fit in.
Yeah, Samenow questions that simple narrative. Even with James Holmes, the Aurora shooter, who is described as isolated, Samenow suggests we need to look closer at his internal world, not just his lack of external connections.
He contrasts him with Toby.
Right. Toby had people trying to help him with social skills, but he actively rejected them. Pushed peers away, dismissed instructors. It suggests the isolation wasn't just circumstance, but an active internal resistance to connecting.
So isolation can be a symptom, not the root cause. What about things like bullying? or gangs?
Well, the theory that bullying victims become bullies themselves, Samenow points out that most kids who are bullied don't become violent offenders.
That makes sense.
And the idea that gangs are like a substitute family, if that were the whole story, he argues, wouldn't everyone in those tough neighborhoods join a gang?
Good point.
He uses the story of two brothers, Jose and Pedro. Same tough environment. Jose joins a gang. Pedro actively resists, has his own vision for his life. It highlights that inner determination, that individual choice, even in the same circumstances.
Pedro's story really drives that home. Okay, let's move into education. How do these criminal patterns show up in school?
Samenow sees three main patterns emerging. First, the dropout's disruptive, anti-authority right from the start.
Okay.
Second, the drop-offs. These are kids who might actually do okay academically early on, but then they just disengage later, lose interest, stop trying.
And the third?
The high achievers.
Right.
Sometimes academic success is used almost like a cover, or it helps them carry out other problematic behaviors.
He gives examples, right? Like dropouts, stealing, disrupting class, schools, maybe even hiding the extent of the problems.
Yes, and for the drop-offs, think of Van, only interested in certain subjects, blaming teachers for his failures. Or Warren, misdiagnosed with ADHD when the real issue was motivation.
And the high achiever example.
Chris, who was gifted but whose life became consumed by an obsession with pornography. Samenow argues it's often the same anti-work, anti-effort attitude seen elsewhere, just applied to school.
He was in college.
Yeah, Mark's story pretending to be intellectual, blaming the college, getting into drugs. It's that drop-off pattern again. And sadly, crime on college campuses is often underreported too.
It sounds like this attitude, this resistance to effort and responsibility,
Yeah.
it just carries right over into the world of work.
Absolutely. Samenow sees very similar thinking. Some criminals barely work at all. Others work off and on, maybe as a cover. And some hold down good jobs long term, but use that position for illicit activities.
He talks about that inflated sense of self-worth, right? Rejecting jobs they see as beneath them.
Mm-hmm. I'm not flipping burgers attitude.
Well.
Or wanting to be a free agent like Aaron, avoiding any kind of structure or accountability. Daniel's case, wanting fun work with no effort. It's unrealistic entitlement.
And status matters more than the work itself.
Often, yes. Status, authority, they can be incredibly critical of others, hate being told what to do, and might use their job for theft, embezzlement, cyber attacks. The cost to businesses is huge.
Wanda's embezzlement case really stands out. Seems responsible, stole a fortune, driven by control, not need.
And white-collar criminals are masters at using their respectable image to deflect blame, attack accusers.
He mentions Nick Leeson and Barings Bank.
Yeah, and Leeson's rationalizations.
Yeah.
Blaming the system, minimizing his role, it's a common thread. Ultimately, Samenow says they often treat people badly at work, at home, and their main regret is simply getting caught.
This all seems to point back to a fundamental desire for power.
That's central to Samonow's analysis. They crave power for its own sake. People become objects, tools to be manipulated.
And this starts young.
Often, yes. It develops in childhood, this sense of entitlement, this view of the world as a chessboard where everyone else is just a pawn in their game.
To make this really concrete, he contrasts those two homicide cases, right? Larry and Trevor.
Yes, Larry from the chaotic inner city, Trevor from the wealthy suburbs. Totally different worlds.
But similar thinking.
Strikingly similar underlying patterns. Larry's negativity toward his mother, his cruelty to siblings, the fighting, contrasted with Trevor's weird mix of admiring and hating his father, his entitlement, exploiting his parents financially, even fantasizing about his father's death.
Wow. Despite the different backgrounds, those core personality traits emerge. And Samenow makes a point about their thinking before a crime versus after.
Yes, that's really key. Before the crime, they're usually not justifying it morally. They're focused on the goal, the plan, how to pull it off, the excitement.
The justifications come later.
Exactly. After they're caught. That's when you hear the excuses, the blame shifting. They know actions have consequences for others intellectually, but in the moment of the crime, that doesn't apply to them.
This seems connected to what he says about sex, too. It's not just about physical urges.
For many criminals, Samenow argues, the main driver isn't just biology. It's the thrill of conquest, the exercise of power.
Starting young.
It can, yes. Sex becomes another way to control, to dominate. Partners are objectified. He even includes that disturbing story about the inmate fascinated by making girls cry. It's about power.
And anyone can be a target, even people in trusted positions.
Absolutely. He then explores the whole spectrum voyeurism like Richard, driven by excitement when life felt dull, attempted rape like Monty, fueled by long-held fantasies and zero remorse.
And the exploitation by people in authority, police officers, clergy, therapists even.
Yes, he covers that abuse of trust. He distinguishes between, say, an inexperienced therapist making a mistake versus someone with an underlying antisocial personality deliberately exploiting their position.
The section on pedophilia must be incredibly difficult. Cases like Father Tom grooming Adele.
It's deeply disturbing, the calculated manipulation, exploiting trust, religious authority. Ned's case, too, the repeated offenses, the rationalizations. The pattern is always misrepresentation, secrecy, and that devastating power imbalance.
He also touches on consuming child pornography, distinguishing between cases like Ben using it in isolation versus those using it to fuel actions against children.
Right, raising complex questions about how we differentiate and respond, the fairness of sentencing. It's not simple.
Let's talk about anger. Samenow links it closely to adversity, doesn't it?
Yes, but adversity for a criminal can mean almost anything that doesn't go their way. It's taken extremely personally.
Like what?
Minor things. Being asked to do menial work, having to ride the bus, being questioned. It's all seen as a put-down, leads to angry outbursts. They cannot stand admitting they're wrong. If I bend, I break, is the mindset.
So anger management classes might not work.
Probably not, Samenow suggests, because the anger isn't just about managing outbursts. It's tied to their ego, their need for control. The real work is changing the thinking that fuels the anger.
Like Kyle, exploding because dinner wasn't ready. Pure control and entitlement.
Exactly. Now, what about drugs and alcohol? Always part of the conversation.
Same as take.
It's very clear. Criminality is in the person, not the substance. Drugs and alcohol intensify what's already there. They don't turn responsible people into criminals overnight.
So 10 people get drunk, only one commits a crime.
Yeah.
It was already in that one person.
That's the idea. He's critical of blaming substances solely or overusing the term addiction. He uses cases like Nancy and Louise to show how substance use was tangled up with pre-existing traits, control issues, attention-seeking, denial.
And this need for control spills into relationships too.
Definitely. Colin's treatment of Judy, the constant criticism, the demands, the violence, it's about domination, and Judy's fear of reporting it. That's tragically common.
Then there's a link to terrorism.
Yeah.
How does that connection work in Samenow's view?
He suggests that individuals craving excitement, who already disregard rules, can be easily drawn to radical causes. They offer structure, ideology, maybe a sense of belonging or purpose, but applied to destructive guns.
And the internet plays a role.
Huge role. Recruitment, ideology, instructions. He even connects things like massive data breaches, like the Target hack, to a kind of modern reign of terror. He warns about criminals gaining sophisticated capabilities.
He's skeptical of just calling it radicalization, though, like with the Boston bombers.
Yeah, he questions if that's the full picture. He suggests looking at their pre-existing tendencies might be more revealing than focusing only on the ideology. He challenges the simple brainwashing explanation.
So circling back.
Yeah.
How do they actually see right and wrong? Do they know the difference?
Samenow says yes, they know the difference, they just make exceptions for themselves. All the time, based on what they want right now.
He quotes someone saying, right is what I want to do at the time.
Exactly. And wrong for them often just means too risky or too petty, not morally wrong in the way most people understand it. Any regret expressed later is usually about getting caught, not about the act itself.
Even religion gets twisted.
It can be, yes. They might use it for comfort or nostalgia, but ultimately it can become another tool. Praying for success in crime, praying to get out of trouble.
Not exactly genuine repentance.
Not usually in the way Samenow describes. While faith-based programs exist and can help some, the underlying patterns often remain without intensive work on thinking errors.
It seems like people who aren't criminals have trouble believing others can be intentionally bad.
That's a key insight. Most people want to see the good in others. It's hard to accept deliberate malice, and criminals are brilliant at exploiting that. Putting on a good face, doing occasional good deeds, saying all the right things, it creates a facade. Irene's story is a perfect example of that instinct to find the good, even when the evidence points elsewhere.
And this entitlement can lead to total ruin, like Troy's case, stealing millions from his family.
Driven by entitlement, impulse, and even then, his parents kept supporting him. His own self-assessment showed zero real insight into his actions. Just blame and justification.
The lack of empathy is just stark.
It really is. Samenow contrasts the normal human response to babies with how some criminals react indifference, even hostility, and offenders against children. They often convince themselves they're good people or rationalize everything they wanted it. It wasn't forced. I thought they were older. Henry, the diplomat making child pornography, saw himself as a patriot.
Just completely detached from the reality of the harm. And this leads to problems with diagnosis in the mental health system.
Huge problems. Clay's case is a prime example. Years of treatment, multiple diagnoses, but no real change because the core criminal thinking wasn't addressed. Psychiatrists were initially optimistic, but he kept relapsing.
It shows the need for a really specific focus.
Yes, on those errors in thinking, with a team trained to recognize and address them, otherwise you're just treating symptoms. Samenow also tackles that idea of a crime being out of character.
Like Bernard Madoff. Respected financier, massive fraud, seemed to come out of nowhere.
But Samenow argues it doesn't come out of nowhere. It's the culmination of long-standing thought patterns, even if they weren't visible externally. Like the husband who murders his wife, it's often preceded by years of mentally annihilating her in his thoughts.
Or Adelanza, the Newtown shooter?
His disturbing writings from when he was young show the violence wasn't sudden. It was likely brewing for years. So snapping is really just the lid blowing off pre-existing pressure.
Which makes therapy incredibly difficult for these individuals.
Extremely. They often see therapists as opponents to outwit. They're experts at deception. That's why, sadly, many who graduate from treatment programs end up reoffending.
So we shouldn't expect mental health professionals to prevent all crime.
It's an unrealistic expectation, Samenow suggests, especially when dealing with skilled manipulators, and the insanity defense itself can be part of the manipulation.
Feigning mental illness to avoid responsibility. Like Dorman claiming the insect's god told him to rob the bank.
Exactly. It's incredibly hard to tell genuine psychosis from a performance. Think of Lee Boyd Malvo, the DC sniper, claiming brainwashing. Compare that to Ariel's case, who clearly had genuine, severe mental health issues. It's complex.
What about prison? Does it change them?
For some, bizarrely, going to prison actually boosts their status among their peers.
Really?
Yeah. But prison life is brutal, survival, proving toughness. Ernie's reflections are telling prison as a university for criminals, a fundamental rejection of a normal life. Theft is rampant, sex is used as a weapon.
But don't some get degrees in prison?
They do, and that's positive. But Samenow cautions that getting a GED or a college degree doesn't automatically change the underlying criminal character or thinking patterns.
So after all this, is genuine change, habilitation, even possible? It sounds pretty bleak.
It's challenging, definitely. There's a lot of public cynicism. But Samenow argues, yes, change is possible.
When?
Often during moments of vulnerability. Facing serious prison time, losing important relationships, or just getting utterly sick of the lifestyle. The person's own mindset, their readiness, is the absolute key.
He includes quotes from inmates wanting something different, right? Acknowledging how hard it is.
Yes, those moments of clarity happen. And a key part of change, he stresses, is becoming a less angry person.
Not just suppressing it, but changing the thinking.
Exactly. Developing realistic expectations, stopping the need to control everyone and everything. He mentions psychologist Paul Hawke, who believed living without chronic anger is achievable.
Leroy's journey is a major example of this change process, isn't it?
It is. It shows the initial struggles, just trying to stay out of trouble through fear. Then Yokelson teaching him to stop and think about the consequences before acting on criminal thoughts.
Like when he got angry at his boss. Learning to manage that reaction.
Right, recognizing how his old patterns would lead straight back to trouble. And Mark's example, too, proactively planning a trip to avoid potential conflicts, shifting from reactive control to proactive management. Leroy's story shows it's an ongoing battle, constant self-monitoring, like rowing away from Niagara Falls.
It sounds like the book itself has had a real impact.
Significant impact. Readers finding explanations for behavior that baffled them. Parents finding relief from misplaced blame, professionals finding the concepts of the criminal mind and errors in thinking incredibly useful.
It's used in corrections, too.
Yes. And interestingly, it's helped people in relationships not necessarily with convicted criminals, but with people exhibiting similar controlling or manipulative patterns to recognize what was happening and make changes.
So what's the core of this Yokelson-Samenow approach?
It's about understanding the day-to-day thinking, the phenomenology, not just searching for distant causes. Change, especially for career criminals, requires an intensive, dedicated process.
Does it require fancy facilities?
Not necessarily. Technology helps monitor offenders now, making community-based habilitation a bit less risky. But the core isn't new buildings. It's trained staff focused relentlessly on identifying and challenging those criminal thinking patterns. That commitment, Samenow concludes, offers the best hope we have. So, wrapping up this deep dive, the key takeaway from Samenow is really that criminality is deeply embedded in specific ways of thinking. It cuts across backgrounds, goes beyond easy explanations.
And while it's incredibly challenging, change is possible. But it requires that intense focus on shifting those ingrained thought patterns.
Exactly. Understanding these insights for you listening can be really powerful, maybe professionally, maybe in personal relationships, or maybe just for a richer understanding of why people do what they do.
It definitely challenges you to think differently.
Which leads to our final thought for you. How does exploring this criminal mind challenge your own assumptions? Your ideas about crime, about responsibility, about the potential for people to truly change?
It's complex stuff, definitely worth reflecting on the need to look beyond those surface explanations.
Absolutely. And if this has sparked your interest, digging further into Stanton Samenow's work is highly recommended.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.